The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Agent Ashley Morgan's latex gloves found the tape labeled June 14, 1994, Isabella. Storage Unit 247 stretched before her team like a mausoleum of secrets, hundreds of VHS tapes stacked in military precision along metal shelving. 30 years of hunting had led to this moment in Henderson, Nevada, a climate-controlled room that smelled of dust and kept promises. "Play it," Morgan said. The television screen flickered to life. Grainy footage revealed blood-stained hands adjusting a camera lens. Deacon Marcus Thornfield's face emerged from the shadows, his clerical collar askew, dark stains marking his white shirt. "I did what had to be done." His voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "The church will survive." Isabella knew too much about Cardinal Castellanos and the money. Before we continue Isabella's story, I need to know who's watching from where, because this case affects communities everywhere. Comment your location below and hit subscribe if you believe every missing child deserves justice. Isabella's voice was silenced for 30 years, but your voice can help amplify her story to families who still need answers. Don't scroll past without acknowledging you were here for her. Morgan's pen stopped moving across her notepad. Behind Thornfield, a crucifix hung crooked on wood-paneled walls. The date stamp read 11:47 p.m. "There are others who will ask questions," Thornfield continued, his eyes fixed on something beyond the camera's reach. "But questions fade. Truth can be buried." Isabella understood this. At the end, the tape cut to static. Outside the storage facility, morning sunlight struck the Nevada mountains with harsh clarity. Morgan pulled her phone from her jacket, fingers steady as she dialed Washington. "Director Walsh. We found him." 30 years earlier, Riverside City, Texas, June 14, 1994. Sacred Heart Cathedral's bells released their morning prayer across the neighborhood, 12 bronze voices calling the faithful to Mass. Mrs. Elena Gutierrez paused while arranging conchas in the window of Dulce Luna Bakery, listening as the final note held in the still air. 30 seconds passed. Then came the 13th chime. She crossed herself quickly and returned to her work. 3 blocks away, Carmen Moreno checked her reflection in the hallway mirror before gathering campaign materials from the dining room table. The city council race had consumed 6 months of her life, but today felt different. Today, Isabella would help distribute flyers after school, a mother-daughter team working to change Riverside City's future. "Mija, remember to wait at the church until I pick you up," Carmen called toward the kitchen where 10-year-old Isabella sat finishing her cereal. "I know, Mommy." Isabella's voice carried the patient exasperation of a child who had heard instructions repeated too many times. After helping Father Miguel with the basement cleanup, Carmen gathered her purse and briefcase, kissing the top of Isabella's dark hair. "Straight to the church office when you're done. No wandering." The front door clicked shut. Isabella finished her cereal and checked the Mickey Mouse watch on her wrist, 7:45 a.m. Plenty of time before the school bus arrived. She pulled her white cotton dress over her head, the one with the hidden pocket sewn inside by her grandmother's careful hands. Isabella had discovered the secret compartment last month while playing dress-up, and now it served as her private storage for treasures too precious for regular pockets. At Riverside City Elementary, Detective Gabriel Restrepo finished his presentation about stranger danger to Mrs. Patterson's 4th-grade class. He had volunteered for these school visits after his partner suggested community outreach might help his career prospects. What Restrepo hadn't expected was how the children's faces would remind him why he became a police officer in the first place. "Officer Restrepo, do you carry handcuffs?" asked a boy in the front row. "Detective Restrepo," he corrected gently, showing his badge. "And yes, but I hope I never have to use them." Isabella Moreno raised her hand from the middle row. "My mom says you help people when they're in trouble." "That's right. Your mom's Carmen Moreno, isn't she? She's running for city council." Isabella nodded proudly. She wants to make sure all kids have safe places to play. After the presentation, Restrepo packed his materials while students filtered toward lunch. He noticed Isabella lingering near his desk, her white dress pristine despite the morning's activities. "Is there something you wanted to ask, Isabella?" She glanced toward the classroom door, then stepped closer. "If someone found something bad, something grown-ups were doing wrong, they should tell a policeman, right?" "Absolutely. What kind of bad thing?" "I'm not sure yet. But if I figured it out, I could call you." Restrepo handed her one of his business cards. "Anytime. Keep that safe, okay? Isabella tucked the card into her dress pocket, the regular one, not the secret compartment where she kept more important things. The afternoon sun slanted through Sacred Heart Cathedral's stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the basement storage room where Isabella sorted donated clothes with Father Miguel Santos. The priest hummed quietly while folding blankets, his movements methodical and peaceful. Isabella, could you organize those boxes near the file cabinets? Just stack them neatly. She nodded and walked toward the corner where cardboard boxes sat beside two tall filing cabinets. As she lifted the first box, papers scattered across the concrete floor, bank statements, canceled checks, photocopied documents stamped with official seals. Isabella knelt to gather the papers, her eyes catching familiar names. Cardinal Vincent Castellanos, Sacred Heart Building Fund. Amounts that made her 8-year-old understanding of money feel suddenly very small. One document showed a photograph paper clipped to the top corner, men in suits shaking hands outside a government building. She recognized one face from her mother's campaign materials, City Councilman Rodriguez, Carmen's opponent in next week's election. Isabella's fingers found the hidden pocket in her dress. She folded the document carefully and slipped it inside, along with 2 photocopied checks that showed signatures she couldn't quite read. Find everything, Mija? Father Miguel approached from behind. Just some papers that fell out. Isabella straightened, her heart beating faster than usual. Church business can be complicated. Good thing we have smart people to handle such matters. Isabella nodded and continued stacking boxes. But her hand stayed close to the hidden pocket, protecting secrets that felt heavier than paper should feel. At 6:30 p.m., Detective Gabriel Restrepo sat in his patrol car outside Sacred Heart Cathedral, waiting for the radio call that would destroy 30 years of his life. His shift had officially ended an hour ago, but paperwork from a domestic disturbance case required finishing before morning court appearances. Through his windshield, he watched late-arriving parishioners hurry toward the evening service. Families with children, elderly couples moving slowly up the cathedral steps, teenagers reluctantly following parents. Normal life, normal concerns. At 6:47 p.m., his radio crackled to life. Unit 23, we have a missing child report. 10-year-old female, last seen at Sacred Heart Cathedral approximately 5 p.m. Restrepo keyed his microphone. Unit 23 responding. ETA 2 minutes. But he was already here, already close enough to see the small bicycle abandoned near the cathedral's side entrance. Pink streamers hung motionless from the handlebars, and a white ribbon his mother had tied to the seat that morning fluttered once in the evening breeze. The bells of Sacred Heart began their evening call to prayer. 12 traditional chimes echoed across Riverside City's quiet streets. Then came the 13th. In her church basement, Isabella Moreno's white dress would be found 4 hours later, carefully folded and placed beside the filing cabinets. In the hidden pocket sewn by loving hands, investigators would discover a Polaroid photograph of financial documents and 2 sets of coordinates written in a child's careful handwriting. But that discovery would wait 30 years, until renovation workers found more than prayers hidden within Sacred Heart Cathedral's walls. Present-day 2024 FBI Field Office, Las Vegas. Dr. Sarah Chun adjusted her reading glasses and opened the evidence box marked, Moreno, Isabella, 1994. 30 years had transformed forensic analysis from educated guesswork into precise science, but cold cases still required the human element that machines couldn't provide. The diary came first. A pink notebook with unicorn stickers, its pages yellowed at the edges. Chun photographed each entry before reading, documenting everything for the federal task force that would inevitably form around this investigation. June 10, 1994. Today, I helped Father Miguel in the basement. There are so many papers about money. Some have pictures of men in suits. I think they're important because they're in the special filing cabinets with locks. Chun's pen paused over her notepad. She flipped through several more entries, watching a 10-year-old's handwriting document what federal investigators had spent decades trying to prove. June 12, 1994, I asked Deacon Thornfield about the papers. He said children shouldn't worry about church business. But his eyes got different when he said it. Like when Tommy Martinez lies about homework. June 13, 1994, Mama says Cardinal Castellanos might become very important in Rome. I wonder if that's why there are so many papers with his name. Tomorrow I'll copy some of the numbers to show Detective Restrepo. He said I could call him if I found something bad. The final entry was dated June 14th, 1994. Chen read it twice before reaching for her phone. I put the important papers in my secret pocket. Deacon Thornfield wants to talk to me after everyone leaves tonight. He says we need to discuss what responsible young ladies should and shouldn't share with outsiders. June 14th, 1994, Sacred Heart Cathedral basement, 4:15 p.m. Isabella knelt beside the filing cabinet, organizing donation forms while Father Miguel prepared for evening mass upstairs. The basement felt cooler than usual, shadows stretching longer as afternoon light faded through the small ground-level windows. She heard footsteps on the wooden stairs. Deacon Marcus Thornfield descended slowly, his black shoes clicking against each step with measured precision. Isabella had known him since childhood. He had blessed her first communion, visited their home when her father deployed overseas, brought groceries when Carmen worked double shifts to pay for nursing school. Isabella, child, Father Miguel mentioned you've been very helpful with the filing. Yes, sir. She continued stacking papers, not looking up. I understand you found some documents that might have seemed unusual. Now she met his eyes. Marcus Thornfield had always possessed an intensity that made children pay attention, but today something different lived behind his gaze. A calculation that hadn't existed during communion blessings or Christmas visits. Just church papers, Deacon Thornfield. Of course. He moved closer, his shadow falling across her workspace. But sometimes church business can appear complicated to young minds. Financial matters often involve numbers and names that might seem concerning, but actually serve God's work. Isabella's hand drifted toward the hidden pocket in her dress. The Polaroid photograph she had taken yesterday felt warm against her fingers, along with the photocopied documents that showed money moving through accounts with Cardinal Castellanos' signature. I don't understand complicated things, she said quietly. That's wise, Isabella. Very wise. Marcus smiled, the expression reaching his eyes, but somehow not touching the rest of his face. Some knowledge carries burdens too heavy for children. The church protects its members by carrying those burdens ourselves. Through the basement window, Isabella could see Father Antonio Velasco tending the garden outside the rectory. He glanced toward the basement, his pruning shears pausing mid-cut when he noticed Marcus's car parked at the side entrance. Isabella, Marcus continued, I think we should discuss what responsible young ladies should and shouldn't share with outsiders. People who don't understand the church's mission might misinterpret documents they're not qualified to evaluate. Father Velasco set down his shears and walked toward the cathedral's side door. Isabella watched him pause at the entrance, his hand on the doorknob, before turning away and returning to his garden. Yes, sir, Isabella whispered. Marcus knelt beside her, his presence filling the small space between filing cabinets and donation boxes. Your mother has such important work ahead of her. The city council position could help many families. It would be unfortunate if misunderstandings about church finances created complications for her campaign. Isabella understood threats, even when spoken gently by men who had baptized her. She also understood that the coordinates written on the back of the Polaroid, numbers she had copied from a surveyor's map found between bank statements, might be the most important discovery of her young life. I just want to help with the cleaning, she said. Of course you do. You're a good child, Isabella. A child who understands that some conversations should remain private. Present day, 2024, Riverside City, Texas. Detective Gabriel Restrepo, now 62 and carrying 30 years of accumulated regret, stood in his backyard reading Dr. Chen's preliminary analysis on his tablet. The federal task force had offered him consulting status on the reopened investigation, a professional courtesy that felt more like organized torture. He had been supposed to pick up Isabella that evening. Carmen Moreno had called the station at 4:30 p.m., asking if Gabriel could collect her daughter from Sacred Heart Cathedral instead of driving there herself. A campaign meeting had run late, and Isabella would be waiting. Gabriel had agreed, then gotten detained at a domestic disturbance call that stretched until 6:15 p.m. 45 minutes that changed everything. By the time he reached Sacred Heart Cathedral, Isabella's bicycle sat abandoned in the parking lot, and Father Miguel was organizing search parties among parishioners who had arrived for evening mass. We found something else, Dr. Chen's voice came through his phone. In the diary, she mentions showing Detective Restrepo what she found. Isabella planned to call you Gabriel. She trusted you. Restrepo closed his eyes and listened to the sound of his neighbor's dog barking at shadows. 30 years ago, he had promised a 10-year-old girl that she could call him anytime. Instead, she had waited alone in a church basement while he filled out paperwork about broken dishes and bruised faces. What else? He asked. Financial records indicate wire transfers to at least 4 different dioceses between 1992 and 1995. Amounts consistent with systematic money laundering operations. And Gabriel, the signature authorization came directly from Cardinal Castellanos, but the implementation was handled by Marcus Thornfield, the church's fixer. Isabella documented everything, including conversations where Thornfield discussed managing problems for the diocese. This wasn't random violence, Gabriel. This was institutional protection. Outside Father Antonio Velasco's window that evening in 1994, Sacred Heart Cathedral's lights had burned until nearly midnight. Velasco had watched Marcus Thornfield's car remain parked at the side entrance long after evening mass concluded, long after the last parishioner departed, long after responsible deacons should have finished their duties. But Father Velasco, like many men of faith, had chosen silence over action that night. A decision that would haunt him for 3 decades, until his dying confession finally reached the right ears. June 15, 1994, Riverside City Police Department, 6:30 a.m. Detective Gabriel Restrepo arrived at the station before sunrise, Isabella Moreno's missing person file tucked under his arm alongside a thermos of coffee that would grow cold before noon. 12 hours had passed since her disappearance. 12 hours that transformed a simple pickup assignment into the defining case of his career. The evidence room smelled of cardboard and industrial cleaning solution. Officer Janet Morrison, the night desk sergeant, handed him the intake box with practiced efficiency. Found at scene, Morrison said, checking items off her list. 1 bicycle, pink with white basket. 1 school backpack, contents inventoried. 1 white cotton dress, found folded in church basement. Restrepo examined the dress through the clear evidence bag. Clean, carefully arranged, as if someone had taken time to present it properly. Folded how? Neat, like for church service. Father Miguel said he didn't fold it. Found it that way when he unlocked the basement this morning. Witnesses. Father Miguel Santos, last person to see her alive around 4:15 p.m., says she was organizing donation papers when he went upstairs for evening mass preparation. Deacon Marcus Thornfield confirmed she was there during afternoon cleanup. Restrepo wrote notes in his careful handwriting, the same methodical approach he applied to every case. Missing children required different protocols than adult disappearances, faster response times, expanded search areas, immediate media alerts. Any signs of struggle? None visible. Church basement was organized, no disturbance. But Detective Morrison lowered her voice. Sergeant Navarro wants to see you before you start interviews. Sergeant Luis Navarro had supervised Riverside City's detective division for 8 years, long enough to understand which cases required delicate handling. He gestured for Restrepo to close the office door before speaking. Sacred Heart Cathedral situation needs careful approach, Navarro said. Father Miguel contacted Archbishop Castellanos last night. Cardinal consideration period makes timing sensitive. Restrepo set down his coffee cup. Sensitive how? Church cooperation essential for investigation success. Heavy-handed questioning could damage community relationships we've built over decades. Isabella Moreno has been missing 14 hours. Exactly why we need church partnership, not confrontation. Navarro opened a manila folder. I'm assigning Officer Rodriguez as secondary investigator. His family attends Sacred Heart, speaks Spanish with witnesses who might feel more comfortable. Restrepo studied his supervisor's face. They had worked together on dozens of cases, established trust through shared night shifts and closed investigations. But today something different existed in Navarro's expression, a careful distance that hadn't existed yesterday. I speak Spanish, Luis. Of course. But Rodriguez understands community dynamics, religious concerns. These people trust him. Through Navarro's office window, Restrepo could see the evidence room where Morrison continued processing Isabella's belongings. Standard procedure required photographing every item, documenting chain of custody, preserving potential forensic evidence for laboratory analysis. What about the dress? Folded placement suggests staging. Or careful child who always folded her clothes. Don't create complications where none exist, Gabriel. Restrepo left Navarro's office with assignments that felt more like restrictions. Interview Father Miguel, but don't press for details that might embarrass the church. Question Deacon Thornfield, but remember his decades of community service. Search the basement, but respect the sacred nature of cathedral property. Carmen Moreno's kitchen, 9:45 a.m. Carmen sat at her dining room table, surrounded by campaign materials that now felt obscene in their irrelevance. Voting would take place in 6 days, but the only election that mattered was whether her daughter would come home alive. Detective Restrepo filled the doorway, his notebook ready, his face carrying the professional sympathy she had seen at other families' tragedies. Now the sympathy was directed at her, and Carmen understood why grief made people angry at the universe. Tell me about yesterday afternoon, Restrepo said gently. Isabella went to school, normal day? She had volunteered to help Father Miguel with basement cleanup after classes ended. I was supposed to pick her up at 5:30 after my campaign meeting. Did she mention anything unusual? Anyone bothering her? Any changes in routine? Carmen remembered Isabella's questions about church finances, her daughter's curious nature that made her notice details other children missed. But those conversations felt private, family discussions that shouldn't involve police investigation. Nothing unusual. Isabella loved helping at church, felt responsible for community service. Restrepo wrote carefully, his handwriting steady despite the weight of his questions. Had she mentioned Deacon Thornfield recently? Any interactions that seemed different? Marcus has known our family for years. He baptized Isabella, visited when her father was deployed. She trusted him completely. Trusted. Past tense, Carmen realized. She was already talking about her daughter's trust as something that belonged to yesterday. Mrs. Moreno, I need to ask about Isabella's dress. Was it her habit to fold clothes carefully when changing? Isabella never changed clothes at church. She wore that dress all day, from morning until. Carmen's voice stopped working properly. Restrepo closed his notebook. We're going to find her, Carmen. But I need you to think about anything Isabella might have mentioned. Church business, adult conversations she might have overheard, anything that seemed to worry her. After Restrepo left, Carmen walked through her house, touching objects that still held Isabella's presence. Breakfast dishes in the sink, homework spread across the kitchen counter, school shoes lined up by the front door. That evening, she would begin keeping her own notebook, documenting conversations and questions that law enforcement wasn't asking. Carmen Moreno was transforming from grieving mother into something more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to investigate. Police station, 3:20 p.m. When Restrepo returned to collect evidence for forensic analysis, Officer Morrison met him at the evidence room door with an expression that immediately triggered his investigative instincts. Problem, he asked. Isabella's backpack. Sergeant Navarro took it an hour ago, said he wanted to review contents before sending to lab. Took it where? Didn't say, but he had Father Miguel with him. Restrepo felt something shift in his understanding of the investigation, a mechanical click like pieces of machinery that had been running smoothly, suddenly finding resistance. Evidence review by supervisors was normal. Evidence review with potential witnesses was not. At 4:47 p.m., Archbishop Vincent Castellanos placed a phone call to Police Chief Raymond Torres. The conversation lasted 6 minutes and resulted in new directives about media interaction, community sensitivity, and the importance of maintaining positive relationships with religious institutions during ongoing Vatican consideration processes. By evening, Detective Gabriel Restrepo would begin questioning whether his own department wanted Isabella Moreno found, or simply wanted her disappearance handled with appropriate discretion. The transformation from trusting investigator to suspicious detective had begun, 30 years before he would finally understand how correct his suspicions had been. June 17, 1994, Sacred Heart Cathedral Rectory, 5:45 a.m. Father Antonio Velasco folded his few possessions into a single suitcase, while dawn painted the rectory walls gray. 48 hours after Isabella Moreno's disappearance, he had received new assignment orders from Archbishop Castellanos, immediate transfer to Our Lady of Guadalupe Parish in Tijuana, Mexico. Pastoral emergency, the official letter stated. Your Spanish language skills urgently needed for expanding immigrant ministry. Velasco knew different reasons drove his sudden relocation. Through his bedroom window 2 nights ago, he had watched Deacon Marcus Thornfield's car remain parked beside Sacred Heart Cathedral until 11:30 p.m. He had seen basement lights burning hours after evening mass concluded. He had witnessed things that made sleep impossible and prayer feel inadequate. Now he packed quietly, moving through early morning routines while other priests prepared for daily services. Father Miguel knocked once on his door, offering help with luggage, but Velasco declined. Some departures required solitude. At 6:15 a.m., a black sedan arrived to transport him directly to San Antonio International Airport. No goodbye ceremony, no farewell blessing, no opportunity to speak with Detective Restrepo, who had called the rectory 3 times requesting interview scheduling. Father Velasco carried his suitcase to the waiting car and did not look back at Sacred Heart Cathedral, whose bells would ring 12 times that morning and then fall silent. Present-day 2024 FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit, Quantico Dr. Sarah Chen's office. The pattern emerged through computer algorithms that hadn't existed in 1994. Dr. Chen scrolled through database results showing clergy transfers across American dioceses between 1990 and 2000, cross-referencing dates with unsolved missing children cases. 17 transfers within 72 hours of child disappearances, she reported to Agent Morgan via video call. All involving priests or deacons who had potential access to victims. All transfers to parishes outside United States jurisdiction. On her second monitor, Chen displayed Marcus Thornfield's psychological profile, constructed through decades of witness statements and behavioral analysis. The portrait revealed a sophisticated predator who understood institutional dynamics better than law enforcement. Thornfield didn't act impulsively, Chen continued. Every action suggests pre-planning, systematic approach to eliminating threats. He used sacred trust as both weapon and shield. Agent Morgan's voice came through the speakers. What about Archbishop Castellanos? Castellanos presents more complex motivations. Vatican records show his cardinal consideration coincided exactly with Isabella's disappearance timeline. Political ambition versus moral duty created perfect vulnerability for manipulation. Chun opened another file, financial records recovered from the Nevada storage unit. Castellanos wasn't directly involved in violence, but his protection of Thornfield enabled systematic continuation. Political career advancement required maintaining institutional reputation. A man who chose power over protection. Multiple times, across multiple dioceses. The money laundering operation Isabella discovered wasn't isolated to Riverside City. She stumbled into documentation of nationwide conspiracy. June 18, 1994, Riverside City Police Department Detective Restrepo's desk. Gabriel stared at the fax transfer notification that had arrived from Sacred Heart Cathedral's administrative office. Father Antonio Velasco, potential witness, Isabella's confessor, the man who might have seen something that first evening, was now beyond reach in Mexican jurisdiction. Convenient timing, Officer Morrison observed, reading over his shoulder. 48-hour turnaround for international transfer doesn't happen through normal church bureaucracy, Gabriel replied. This required intervention from higher authority. He pulled Isabella's case file from his desk drawer, noting how thin the documentation remained after 4 days of investigation. Witness statements that revealed nothing, evidence that suggested nothing, leads that progressed nowhere. Sergeant Navarro approached with coffee and subtle warning. Gabriel, Chief Torres wants to discuss case management strategy. Thinks maybe Rodriguez should take primary investigator status, given his community connections. Rodriguez has been detective for 6 months. Experience isn't everything. Sometimes fresh perspective identifies opportunities veteran investigators miss. Gabriel understood bureaucratic language well enough to recognize demotion disguised as collaboration. Someone wanted him removed from Isabella Moreno's case. Someone with enough authority to override normal assignment procedures. I'll speak with Chief Torres directly. He's in meetings with diocesan representatives this afternoon, scheduling conflicts until next week. Through the station windows, Gabriel could see Sacred Heart Cathedral's bell tower rising above Riverside City's downtown buildings. 12 bells that had rung for morning services, calling faithful to prayer and contemplation. But the 13th bell remained silent, waiting for reasons that lived in ancient traditions older than law enforcement procedures. 2003 Phoenix, Arizona St. Catherine's Parish. Detective Maria Santos reviewed the missing child report filed 3 days earlier. 8-year-old Miguel Rodriguez had disappeared after voluntary church cleanup, his bicycle found abandoned in the parish parking lot. The similarities to cases in other southwestern cities created patterns that local departments were beginning to notice. Santos called Riverside City Police Department, requesting information about comparable cases from the previous decade. Detective Gabriel Restrepo answered her call personally. Isabella Moreno case, Restrepo said. 1994, same MO, child volunteer, church setting, bicycle abandonment. Never solved. Any witnesses transferred immediately afterward? Father who might have seen something. Shipped to Mexico within 48 hours. Never interviewed. Santos made notes in her file. We had similar transfer here. Deacon Marcus Thornfield relocated to our parish in 1998, now moved again to New Mexico after Miguel's disappearance. Same Thornfield, same name, same administrative role. Fixes problems for diocese, handles sensitive institutional matters. Gabriel sat in silence, processing information that transformed isolated tragedy into systematic operation. Maria, I think we need to make some phone calls. Present-day 2024 FBI Field Office, Las Vegas Agent Morgan's conference room. The evidence wall covered 12 feet of whiteboard space, connecting photographs, documents, and timeline markers with red string that mapped 30 years of institutional conspiracy. Dr. Chen stood before the display, pointing to transfer records that revealed the scope of organizational protection. Father Velasco was an isolated case, she explained to the assembled task force. We've identified 47 clergy transfers between 1990 and 2010, all occurring within 72 hours of criminal investigations involving children. Agent Rodriguez raised his hand. All involving Thornfield. Thornfield's administrative influence extended across multiple dioceses. He functioned as institutional fixer, managing threats through systematic witness elimination and evidence suppression. Chen moved to another section of the wall, where photographs showed missing children from 6 different states. Isabella Moreno discovered financial documentation, but she wasn't the only child who posed threats to the operation. Agent Morgan studied the connections between cases, locations, and transfer dates. How many victims? Confirmed? 17 children across 12 dioceses. Suspected? The number approaches 40. The room felt quiet. Outside the conference windows, Las Vegas stretched toward distant mountains, but the landscape felt suddenly smaller, contained within the systematic evil that had operated across state lines for decades. Agent Morgan, Dr. Chen continued, there's something else. Father Velasco wasn't the only witness transferred from Riverside City in June 1994. She attached new documents to the evidence wall. Personnel records showing multiple transfers within the same week Isabella disappeared. Father Miguel Santos, relocated to Oregon. Deacon Robert Martinez, assigned to Alaska Mission. Custodial staff member Elena Gutierrez's brother, transferred to Arizona Diocese maintenance crew. Morgan approached the wall, counting names. Entire potential witness network eliminated within 1 week. Systematic institutional conspiracy, protected through ecclesiastical authority that superseded civil law enforcement jurisdiction. Gabriel Restrepo, attending via video conference from Texas, spoke from the screen. 30 years too late, but now we understand what we were fighting. The 13th bell had been silent for 3 decades, waiting for justice that required technology and federal authority to pursue across state lines and institutional boundaries. But silence, like truth, eventually finds its expiration date. October 12, 2001, Riverside City Elementary School, 3:45 p.m. Detective Gabriel Restrepo sat in his patrol car outside the school entrance, watching children emerge from afternoon classes like scattered leaves in autumn wind. 7 years had passed since Isabella Moreno's disappearance. 7 years of cold case reviews and dead-end investigations that had shaped him into something harder than the optimistic detective who once visited classrooms to discuss stranger danger. Sophia Restrepo appeared at the school doors, her backpack sliding off one shoulder as she searched the pickup area for her father's familiar car. At 11 years old, She possessed her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn curiosity, traits that made Gabriel simultaneously proud and terrified in a world where children vanished without explanation. Poppy. Sophia climbed into the passenger seat, filling the car with energy that momentarily pushed away the weight of unsolved cases. Mrs. Rodriguez says you're coming to career day next week, if work allows. Gabriel helped her adjust the seatbelt, noting how she had grown taller over the summer, approaching the age Isabella had been when everything changed. How was school? Good. We're studying local history, and I told everyone about your detective work. Mrs. Rodriguez said maybe you could talk about the Isabella Moreno case, since it's part of Riverside City's story. Gabriel's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Teachers shouldn't discuss active investigations with elementary students, even cold cases that had consumed local attention for years. Sophia, that's not appropriate for school presentations. But you're still working on it, right? You still have her picture on your desk. Through the rearview mirror, Gabriel could see Sacred Heart Cathedral's bell tower rising above the neighborhood, a constant reminder of questions that remained unanswered. Isabella's school photo sat beside his computer monitor, aging backward as the years accumulated, forever 10 years old, while Sophia grew older, approaching dangerous territories. Some cases take time to solve, he said carefully. Mama says you blame yourself for not picking her up that day. Gabriel pulled into their driveway and turned off the engine. These conversations had become more frequent as Sophia matured, her understanding of adult responsibilities sharpening into uncomfortable clarity. Your mother talks too much sometimes. She's worried about you. And about me, when I volunteer at church. St. Michael's Catholic Church, October 13, 2001, for 30 p.m. Sophia knelt beside the donation boxes in St. Michael's basement, sorting clothes for the parish's annual charity drive. Gabriel had chosen this church specifically, different diocese, different administration, different geographic area from Sacred Heart Cathedral. Safety through distance and careful supervision. Father Joseph Manning supervised the volunteer children, his presence providing security that Gabriel required before allowing Sophia to participate in church activities. Manning was young, recently ordained, with background checks that satisfied even a detective father's paranoia about institutional trust. Sophia, could you organize those boxes near the storage room? Just stack them neatly, Father Manning called from across the basement. She nodded and walked toward the corner where cardboard boxes sat beside filing cabinets that looked similar to the ones Isabella had worked near 7 years earlier. The similarity wasn't coincidence. Catholic Church administration followed consistent organizational patterns across parishes. As Sophia lifted the first box, papers scattered across the concrete floor, bank statements, transfer authorizations, photocopied documents with official stamps. Names she recognized from her father's investigation files. Archbishop Castellanos, Deacon Marcus Thornfield, Sacred Heart Cathedral Building Fund. Sophia's heart began beating faster as she gathered the papers, understanding that she had discovered something important, something connected to the case that haunted her father's sleep. She pulled her cell phone from her backpack, technology that hadn't existed during Isabella's time, and photographed several documents before Father Manning approached. Find everything, Sophia? Just papers that fell out of the box, she replied, slipping her phone back into her pocket. Father Manning helped restack the boxes, his movements careful and precise. Church business can be complicated. Sometimes adult matters appear in donation materials by mistake. Sophia nodded but kept thinking about the documents, about her father's obsession with patterns and connections, about Isabella Moreno's white dress found folded in another church basement. At 5:15 p.m., she called Gabriel's cell phone. Poppy, I need you to pick me up early. I found something you should see. The call went directly to voicemail. Riverside City Police Department, 6:45 p.m. Gabriel's desk phone rang while he reviewed witness statements from a domestic violence case. The caller ID showed St. Michael's Parish Office. Detective Restrepo, this is Father Manning. Sophia didn't show up for evening pickup. Her volunteer coordinator says she left around 5:30, but no one saw her actually leave the building. Gabriel's hand froze on the receiver. Left with whom? Unknown. The basement was locked when I checked at 6 p.m., but Sophia's backpack was found in the storage room. Time compressed into a narrow tunnel of possibility and terror. Gabriel grabbed his keys and radio, calling for backup units while racing towards St. Michael's Parish. 7 years of investigating Isabella's disappearance had prepared him for this moment and made it infinitely worse. He understood exactly what questions needed asking and exactly why those questions might not receive answers. Present day 2024, Gabriel Restrepo's home office, 11:30 p.m. Gabriel sat surrounded by 23 years of accumulated evidence. Wall charts connecting Sophia's disappearance to Isabella's case. DNA analysis reports that had advanced from primitive markers in 2001 to sophisticated genealogical tracking in 2024. Digital communication records that documented systematic institutional conspiracy across multiple dioceses. Dr. Sarah Chen's voice came through his computer speakers during their nightly case review conference. Gabriel, the technological advancement has been remarkable. Sophia's cell phone photographs from October 13th provided our first documentary evidence of financial connections between Thornfield and multiple parishes. She was trying to help solve Isabella's case. 11 years old, and she understood patterns better than law enforcement. Her evidence collection contributed directly to federal indictment authorizations. Sophia's investigation mattered. Gabriel studied the photograph on his desk. Sophia at age 11, smiling beside him at her 6th grade graduation, months before she disappeared. Time had stopped for his daughter the same way it had stopped for Isabella, preserving them both at ages when children still believed in justice and trusted adults to protect them. Dr. Chun, tell me about the MO comparisons. Identical methodology. Church volunteer setting, basement location, abandoned personal belongings arranged carefully, witness elimination through administrative transfer. Sophia's disappearance followed exact same systematic approach. Meaning Thornfield knew I was still investigating Isabella's case. Meaning he targeted Sophia specifically to silence your pursuit. Your daughter became collateral damage, an institutional protection strategy. Gabriel walked to his evidence wall, where red string connected Sophia's case to Isabella's investigation, both leading toward Marcus Thornfield's psychological profile and Archbishop Castellanos's political protection. 23 years of technological advancement had provided answers that remained incomplete without the most important element, bringing his daughter home. Outside his window, Riverside City slept while Sacred Heart Cathedral's bells remained silent, waiting for justice that required federal authority and forensic genealogy to pursue across decades of systematic concealment. But Gabriel Restrepo's pursuit had transformed from professional duty into personal redemption, powered by a father's refusal to surrender and strengthened by technology that finally made institutional conspiracy vulnerable to individual determination. The curse that had taken 2 daughters would end with the truth that had taken 30 years to document. The digital breakthrough. March 15, 2018. TikTok user at Cold Case Crystal's bedroom, Phoenix, Arizona. Crystal Rodriguez had never heard of Isabella Moreno until the algorithm delivered a 24-year-old missing person poster to her social media feed. The amateur sleuth community on TikTok thrived on forgotten cases, abandoned investigations, and the democratization of justice through crowdsourced research. Day 1 of investigating the Isabella Moreno case. Crystal spoke to her phone camera, the poster visible on her laptop screen behind her. 10-year-old disappeared from Sacred Heart Cathedral in Riverside City, Texas, 1994. 0 arrests, 0 convictions, case went cold. Crystal's followers had grown accustomed to her methodical approach to cold cases, genealogy research, public record searches, cross-referencing missing person databases with contemporary news reports. Her investigation into the Marjorie Deal Armstrong case had generated 2.3 million views and contributed to renewed law enforcement interest. But here's where it gets interesting, Crystal continued, pulling up archived newspaper articles. Detective Gabriel Restrepo's own daughter Sophia disappeared in 2001, same MO, same geographic area. Like someone was sending a message. The video gained 47,000 views in 6 hours. Within 48 hours, amateur investigators across multiple platforms had compiled comprehensive timelines, identified patterns across dioceses, and generated enough public pressure to attract federal attention. Crystal's follow-up videos documented financial connections between Sacred Heart Cathedral and suspicious transfers involving Deacon Marcus Thornfield. This isn't random violence, she explained to 180,000 followers in her 7th video. This is systematic institutional protection. Someone needs to run facial recognition on Thornfield across decades of church photography. Dr. Sarah Chun, monitoring social media breakthrough developments from her FBI office, took detailed notes. Present-day 2024 FBI Forensic Laboratory, Quantico. Dr. Sarah Chun's workstation. The facial recognition algorithm had been processing for 36 hours, analyzing every available photograph of Marcus Thornfield from 1985 through 2024. Chun watched progress bars advance across multiple monitors while artificial intelligence compared bone structure, facial geometry, and biometric markers with precision that would have seemed miraculous to 1994 investigators. Agent Morgan, Chun called across the laboratory floor. You need to see these results. The first monitor displayed Thornfield photographs from the 1980s, ordination ceremony, parish newsletters, diocesan administrative gatherings. Young face, clear features, distinctive facial architecture that served as baseline for comparison analysis. The second monitor showed Thornfield in the 1990s, including surveillance footage recovered from Sacred Heart Cathedral's security system, enhanced through digital restoration techniques that revealed details invisible to original investigators. June 14, 1994, for 47 p.m., Chun pointed to timestamp data. Cathedral security camera captured Thornfield entering basement level with Isabella Moreno. Technology from 1994 produced images too degraded for identification, but modern enhancement reveals clear facial structure. Agent Morgan studied the footage, watching grainy black and white images transform into recognizable faces through algorithmic processing. Quality improvement is remarkable, but that's not the breakthrough. Chun continued, opening files on the third monitor. AI facial recognition identifies significant discrepancies in bone structure measurements across the timeline. The algorithm had flagged inconsistencies that human observation had missed. Subtle differences in facial geometry, eye spacing, jaw structure that suggested two different individuals rather than natural aging progression. Two different men? Morgan asked. Statistically significant variations in biometric markers. Someone has been using Marcus Thornfield's identity for decades, but facial bone structure doesn't lie to artificial intelligence. Chun opened comparative analysis results showing percentage confidence ratings for identity matches. The data revealed what 30 years of human investigation had failed to detect: systematic identity fraud operating within religious institutional protection. Sacred Heart Cathedral Security Office 1994 versus 2024 technology comparison. The original security system had recorded Isabella's last known movements on magnetic tape using technology that produced images barely suitable for human identification. Detective Restrepo had studied those tapes countless times, seeing shadows and suggestions rather than actionable evidence. 30 years later, AI enhancement algorithms applied computational power that exceeded entire 1990s police departments. Dr. Chin's laboratory had transformed unusable surveillance footage into courtroom-quality evidence through digital processing that analyzed light patterns, shadow mapping, and mathematical reconstruction of degraded visual data. Artificial intelligence doesn't experience fatigue or emotional investment, Chin explained to the federal task force during their morning briefing. It identifies patterns human investigators miss, processes vast datasets beyond individual capability, and applies consistent analytical standards across decades of accumulated evidence. The enhanced footage revealed Marcus Thornfield's facial features with clarity that would have solved Isabella's case in 1994 if the technology had existed. But more importantly, it revealed inconsistencies in those features that suggested a fundamental deception operating within the investigation itself. Georgetown University Digital Forensics Research Laboratory. Dr. Amanda Way's office. Dr. Way had pioneered forensic genealogy techniques that revolutionized cold case investigation, combining DNA analysis with public databases to identify suspects through family connections spanning multiple generations. Her collaboration with Dr. Chun represented the convergence of multiple scientific disciplines focused on Isabella Moreno's case. Traditional investigation relied on witness testimony, physical evidence, and geographical proximity, Dr. Way explained to her graduate students during their weekly seminar. Contemporary forensic science applies computational analysis to datasets that reconstruct events with mathematical precision. She displayed the Moreno case timeline on the classroom smartboard, showing how social media research had generated leads that federal algorithms had transformed into actionable intelligence. Amateur investigators on TikTok identified financial patterns that professional law enforcement had missed for 24 years. Crowdsourced research democratizes justice by applying collective intelligence to systematic institutional deception. The students took notes while Dr. Way described the intersection of technology and justice, how artificial intelligence had become the most powerful tool for penetrating organized conspiracy. Faith-based institutions have historically operated beyond scientific scrutiny, Dr. Way continued. But digital evidence doesn't respect ecclesiastical authority. Truth emerges through mathematical analysis rather than institutional cooperation. FBI Field Office, Las Vegas Evening Briefing, 5:45 p.m. Agent Morgan stood before the evidence wall, where red string-connected photographs, documents, and timeline markers accumulated over 30 years of investigation. Dr. Chen's facial recognition analysis had fundamentally altered their understanding of the conspiracy. Artificial intelligence has identified two distinct individuals using Marcus Thornfield's identity between 1985 and 2024, Morgan announced to the assembled task force. Biometric analysis indicates systematic identity fraud spanning multiple decades. Detective Gabriel Restrepo, attending via video conference, spoke from his home office in Texas, meaning the man who killed Isabella might not be the same man we've been pursuing. Meaning someone has been operating under stolen identity for purposes of continuing institutional protection. The conspiracy is more sophisticated than we understood. Dr. Chun added supplementary analysis. Facial recognition confidence ratings show 94.7% probability that pre-1991 and post-1991 Thornfield photographs represent different individuals. Someone assumed the identity and continued the operation. Agent Rodriguez raised his hand. Twin brother? Family member with access to documentation. Database searches show Marcus Thornfield had a twin brother, Daniel, reported deceased in 1991. But artificial intelligence suggests otherwise. The briefing room fell silent as federal investigators processed implications that transformed their understanding of 30 years of investigation. Technology had revealed that their target had been hidden in plain sight, protected by assumed identity and institutional cooperation that superseded law enforcement authority. Outside the Las Vegas field office, city lights stretched toward distant mountains while sacred bells remained silent in Texas, waiting for justice that required artificial intelligence to penetrate decades of human deception. Crystal Rodriguez's TikTok investigation had generated 12 million views and federal task force formation. Dr. Sarah Chen's forensic genealogy had identified genetic evidence invisible to previous technology. Artificial intelligence had detected facial recognition patterns that human observation had missed. The digital age had finally caught up with institutional conspiracy, armed with tools that made secrets obsolete and truth inevitable. Isabella's generation didn't have the technology to protect themselves. Your generation does. But technology is worthless if stories like this don't reach the people who need to hear them. Subscribe and share this video. Because the next Isabella deserves a world that's paying attention. The Twin Revelation. Present-day 2024 FBI Forensic Laboratory, Quantico, 2:30 a.m. Dr. Sarah Chen stared at dual monitors displaying facial recognition analysis that would rewrite 30 years of investigation. The artificial intelligence had completed its comparison of biometric markers across decades of Marcus Thornfield photographs, revealing mathematical impossibilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about identity and deception. Agent Morgan. Chen called across the empty laboratory, her voice carrying urgency that made the night shift supervisor abandon his coffee. I need you to see this immediately. The first monitor showed comparative facial geometry from 1985 through 1990. Consistent bone structure, eye spacing, and jaw measurements that established baseline biometric identity for Marcus Thornfield. Young priest, recently ordained, serving Sacred Heart Cathedral with apparent devotion and institutional trust. The second monitor displayed identical analysis from 1991 through 2024, statistically significant variations in facial architecture that indicated different skeletal structure, different genetic heritage, different human being entirely. Confidence rating for identity match between pre-1991 and post-1991 subjects is 3.2%, Chen explained, highlighting algorithmic conclusions that transformed their understanding of the case. Artificial intelligence indicates two distinct individuals, not natural aging progression. Agent Morgan studied the data while Chen opened additional files containing death certificate analysis, DNA comparison protocols, and genealogical research that had consumed federal resources for months. Marcus Thornfield officially died in a car accident outside Amarillo, Texas, November 15, 1991, Chen continued. Single vehicle collision, body burned beyond recognition, identification based on vehicle registration and personal effects found at the scene. But someone continued using his identity. Someone with intimate knowledge of his background, institutional relationships, and administrative responsibilities. Someone who could assume his role without arousing suspicion from colleagues or superiors. Chen opened a third file containing genealogical records that revealed the foundation of 30 years of systematic deception. Marcus had a twin brother, Daniel Thornfield. Identical birth certificates, shared childhood, parallel education through seminary training. Daniel was dismissed from priestly ordination in 1989 for psychological evaluation concerns, but maintained contact with Marcus through family connections. The laboratory's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, while federal investigators processed implications that reached beyond single criminal case into comprehensive institutional betrayal. Someone had been operating under stolen identity for 3 decades, protected by religious authority and administrative bureaucracy that superseded civil law enforcement. November 16, 1991, St. Joseph's Seminary, Austin, Texas. Daniel Thornfield sat in the morgue identification room, staring at remains that bore no resemblance to his twin brother Marcus. The car accident had burned the body beyond visual recognition, leaving only dental records and personal effects to establish identity for official documentation. "I'm sorry for your loss," the funeral director said softly. Father Marcus was respected throughout the diocese. His service to Sacred Heart Cathedral inspired many faithful. Daniel nodded while signing authorization forms that would transform his understanding of possibility and moral compromise. Marcus had called him 3 days before the accident, confessing involvement in covering up institutional problems that threatened his career and the church's reputation. "I don't know how to live with what I've protected," Marcus had said during their final phone conversation. "The children, Daniel. The money. Archbishop Castellanos says we're serving God's greater purpose, but I can't pray anymore." Now Marcus was dead, and Daniel possessed intimate knowledge of his brother's administrative responsibilities, personal relationships, and the systematic conspiracy that had consumed his faith. The funeral director handed him Marcus's personal effects, wallet, keys, appointment calendar filled with meetings about financial management and personnel transfers. Daniel had failed priestly ordination due to psychological evaluations that questioned his emotional stability and institutional loyalty. But Marcus had succeeded, ascending to positions of trust and authority that could protect or destroy families, depending on administrative decisions. The choice Daniel made in that morgue would define 30 years of deception and enable systematic institutional conspiracy across multiple states. He assumed his dead brother's identity not through malice, but through misguided loyalty to Marcus's memory and gradual corruption through ecclesiastical power. 1991 to 1994 Sacred Heart Cathedral Administrative Transition. Daniel's transformation into Marcus required meticulous attention to behavioral details, speech patterns, and institutional relationships that his twin had cultivated over decades of service. He studied Marcus's personal notes, memorized parishioner names, and practiced signatures until handwriting analysis would confirm authenticity. The Archbishop expressed satisfaction with Marcus's renewed dedication to diocesan priorities following his brother's tragic death. Daniel had explained his temporary grief-related absence as spiritual retreat, emerging with apparent commitment to administrative duties that pleased ecclesiastical superiors. "Your recent trauma has focused your service," Archbishop Castellanos observed during their January 1992 meeting. Personal loss sometimes clarifies institutional priorities. Daniel nodded, understanding that his assumption of Marcus's identity had been accepted without question by religious authority that prioritized institutional stability over individual verification. He had become his brother's protector, continuing Marcus's work while gradually adopting Marcus's moral compromises. By June 1994, Daniel Thornfield had transformed completely into Marcus Thornfield, wielding institutional authority to protect church interests regardless of individual cost. Isabella Moreno's discovery of financial documents posed threats that required solutions Marcus would have found unthinkable, but Daniel had learned to justify through ecclesiastical reasoning. Present-day 2024 FBI conference room, Las Vegas Emergency Task Force meeting. Agent Morgan displayed the twin revelation analysis to assembled federal investigators, while Dr. Chun provided technical explanation of biometric discoveries that fundamentally altered their understanding of the conspiracy. Daniel Thornfield has been operating under his dead brother's identity for 33 years, Morgan announced. Isabella Moreno was murdered by someone who stole ecclesiastical authority to continue systematic institutional protection. Detective Gabriel Restrepo, attending via video conference from Texas, spoke with voice that carried 3 decades of accumulated understanding, meaning Marcus never killed Isabella. Marcus was already dead, meaning Daniel assumed responsibility for covering up Marcus's involvement in earlier crimes, then continued the operation using stolen identity and church protection. Dr. Chun added psychological analysis that explained Daniel's evolution from protective brother into systematic predator. Initial motivation appears to have been preserving Marcus's reputation and institutional standing. But gradual exposure to ecclesiastical power and administrative authority corrupted original protective intentions. The conference room fell silent as federal investigators processed the scope of deception that had operated beyond their jurisdiction for decades. Someone had weaponized religious identity to commit systematic crimes while protected by institutional authority that considered internal discipline more important than civil law enforcement. Current status? Agent Rodriguez asked. Daniel Thornfield remains alive, operating under Marcus's identity at St. Christopher's Parish in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Chun replied. Local law enforcement reports recent child disappearance with identical MO, volunteer church work, basement location, abandoned bicycle. Agent Morgan closed the case files and reached for her phone. We need federal arrest warrants, multi-state jurisdiction, and coordination with New Mexico authorities. 30 years of systematic deception ends today. Outside the Las Vegas field office, morning sunlight struck distant mountains while sacred bells prepared to ring across American dioceses. But in Texas, Sacred Heart Cathedral's 13th bell remained silent, waiting for justice that required federal authority and technological advancement to penetrate 3 decades of identity theft and institutional conspiracy. Daniel Thornfield had protected his brother's memory by becoming his brother's monster, wielding stolen identity and ecclesiastical authority to continue systematic evil that religious institutions had enabled through administrative bureaucracy and moral compromise. The twin revelation had exposed ultimate betrayal, not just of Isabella Moreno and Sofia Restrepo, but of faith itself, transformed into weapon against the innocent by someone who had assumed sacred identity for purposes of systematic deception. Artificial intelligence had finally detected what human observation had missed for 30 years, revealing truth that made justice both possible and inevitable. Present-day 2024, Willow Creek Road, Texas, 6:15 a.m. The coordinates written in Isabella Moreno's 10-year-old handwriting led FBI excavation teams to a grove of mesquite trees 30 miles southeast of Riverside City. Dr. Sarah Chun held the original Polaroid photograph, while ground-penetrating radar confirmed subsurface anomalies that matched burial patterns identified at similar sites across 3 states. Agent Morgan coordinated radio communications between excavation crews, forensic anthropologists, and federal prosecutors who had assembled the largest task force in Texas FBI history. 30 years after Isabella's disappearance, technology was finally delivering answers to questions that had consumed multiple generations of investigators. Ground radar indicates at least 6 distinct burial sites. Dr. Patricia Valdez, the lead forensic anthropologist, reported while marking locations with orange flags. Depth and spacing suggests systematic disposal over extended time frame. Agent Morgan noted the coordinates in her field book, the same numbers Isabella had copied from surveyor maps found between bank statements in Sacred Heart Cathedral's basement, preserved in the hidden pocket of a white dress for 3 decades until renovation workers discovered them during church restoration. The girl who had documented financial conspiracy through childlike detective work had also identified the location where systematic institutional violence disposed of evidence that threatened ecclesiastical authority. FBI Mobile Command Unit 7:45 a.m. Detective Gabriel Restrepo stood beside the communication trailer, watching excavation teams work with archaeological precision through soil that had kept secrets since the 1990s. Federal jurisdiction had finally provided resources that local law enforcement could never access, but the emotional weight of discovery belonged to families who had waited decades for closure. Gabriel, Dr. Chen approached with preliminary forensic analysis that would answer questions he had carried for 30 years. Initial examination suggests multiple victims, ages consistent with missing children reports from 1992 through 2001. Sophia? Possible. We'll need DNA confirmation, but burial timeline matches her disappearance date. The systematic disposal pattern indicates Daniel Thornfield used this location for multiple cases across his operational period. Restrepo watched FBI photographers document evidence that would finally provide answers to Carmen Moreno, who had transformed grief into an underground investigation network that connected families across southwestern states. Isabella's mother had spent 3 decades building databases of missing children, suspicious clergy transfers, and financial irregularities that federal authorities were now validating through official investigation. How many families? Restrepo asked. Preliminary estimates suggest 17 victims across 6 states. Daniel Thornfield's administrative influence enabled multi-diocesan operation that moved children, eliminated witnesses, and disposed of evidence through coordinated institutional protection. The Morning Texas Sun illuminated excavation work that represented convergence of technology, federal authority, and systematic documentation accumulated through decades of individual determination. Isabella's Polaroid coordinates had become the foundation for exposing conspiracy that operated beyond state jurisdiction and civil law enforcement capability. FBI Forensic Laboratory DNA Analysis Division 11:30 a.m. Dr. Amanda Way processed genetic samples recovered from Willow Creek excavation while comparing results to national databases containing family DNA submissions from cold case investigations spanning 3 decades. Modern forensic technology could identify victims through genetic markers that connected them to living relatives across multiple generations. Match confirmed for Isabella Moreno, Dr. Way announced to Agent Morgan via secure video conference. DNA comparison with maternal samples shows 99.97% probability of identification. Agent Morgan's voice carried relief mixed with renewed determination. Additional victims? Confirmed matches for Sofia Restrepo, Miguel Rodriguez from Phoenix, Elena Santos from New Mexico, David Chen from Colorado. Multiple additional samples pending analysis, but preliminary results indicate systematic operation across southwestern dioceses. Dr. Way's laboratory had become the center of federal investigation that revealed how institutional conspiracy had operated beyond individual jurisdiction, protected by ecclesiastical authority that superseded local law enforcement and enabled systematic violence through administrative cooperation. Agent Morgan, there's something else. Genetic analysis indicates all victims shared similar discovery patterns. They had documented evidence of financial irregularities or witnessed administrative misconduct that threatened institutional reputation. They were silenced because they knew too much. Isabella wasn't a random victim. She was eliminated because her investigation threatened billion-dollar money laundering operation that funded political campaigns and enabled systematic abuse cover-ups across multiple states. Vatican City Apostolic Palace, 1:15 p.m. local time. Cardinal Vincent Castellanos reviewed federal extradition requests while consulting with Vatican legal advisors about ecclesiastical immunity and international jurisdiction protocols. FBI investigation had expanded beyond American dioceses into financial networks that connected church administration with European banking systems and political campaign funding. The Americans have documented systematic institutional conspiracy, Cardinal Secretary Marco Benedetti explained while reviewing FBI evidence summaries. Money laundering charges include Vatican bank transactions that enabled multinational operation. Castellanos studied financial records that showed wire transfers between American dioceses and Vatican accounts, funds that had supported his political advancement while protecting systematic abuse networks through administrative silence and witness elimination. Diplomatic immunity? Limited protection for religious administration, but criminal conspiracy charges supersede ecclesiastical privilege. Federal prosecutors have documentation spanning 30 years of coordinated criminal activity. Through the Cardinal's office window, St. Peter's Square stretched toward Rome's ancient streets where pilgrims gathered for spiritual guidance and institutional wisdom. But modern justice operated through different principles, federal authority and technological evidence that made sacred immunity obsolete when protecting systematic violence. Riverside City Community Center Evening Press Conference, 7 p.m. Carmen Moreno stood before assembled families whose children had disappeared across 3 decades of institutional conspiracy, their faces carrying grief that federal investigation was finally transforming into justice and closure. Isabella's mother had organized this gathering to honor victims whose voices had been silenced by systematic ecclesiastical protection. Isabella led us here. Carmen spoke to the audience that included Gabriel Restrepo, whose decades of guilt were finally resolving into redemption and purpose. Her investigation, her documentation, her courage to record truth when adults failed to protect her. Agent Morgan presented forensic evidence that confirmed identifications, while Dr. Chun explained technological advancement that had finally penetrated systematic deception through artificial intelligence and genetic analysis that revealed patterns invisible to previous investigation methods. Federal task force has arrested Daniel Thornfield in Albuquerque, Morgan announced. Additional arrest warrants issued for 17 accomplices across 6 states, including current diocese administrators who enabled systematic conspiracy through administrative protection. Carmen held Isabella's school photograph while addressing families who had waited decades for answers. Our children's voices have been silenced, but their truth survives. Technology has finally made justice possible. FBI Field Office, Las Vegas Evidence Analysis, Division, 9:45 p.m. Dr. Chun completed Vatican financial analysis that revealed international scope of conspiracy that had operated across continental boundaries through ecclesiastical banking networks and diplomatic immunity protection. Isabella's Polaroid coordinates had led to discoveries that exposed multinational criminal organization disguised as religious administration. Agent Morgan, Chun reported through secure communication. Vatican bank records show Cardinal Castellanos currently operating from Swiss financial institutions, coordinating similar operations across European dioceses. Current location? Geneva, Switzerland. Federal prosecutors are coordinating with Interpol for international arrest warrants, but diplomatic complications could delay extradition proceedings. The evidence wall now covered entire conference room walls, connecting 17 victims to systematic conspiracy that had operated across national boundaries through religious authority and financial networks that superseded individual jurisdiction. Isabella Moreno's 10-year-old investigation had revealed truth that required federal resources and international cooperation to pursue through diplomatic channels and ecclesiastical immunity that protected systematic evil through administrative privilege. But truth, like sacred bells, eventually demands to be heard across all boundaries: civil and sacred, national and international, temporal and eternal. Cardinal Castellanos' protection was finally ending, 30 years after a child's courage documented his crimes. Present-day 2024 Sacred Heart Cathedral, Riverside City, Texas, 11:47 a.m. Daniel Thornfield knelt in the same basement where Isabella Moreno had discovered financial documents 30 years earlier, his hands shaking as FBI agents read federal charges that would end 3 decades of systematic deception. Agent Morgan held the arrest warrant while Dr. Chun documented the location for forensic closure, completing investigation circles that had begun with a 10-year-old girl's courage. Daniel Marcus Thornfield, you are under arrest for the murders of Isabella Moreno, Sofia Restrepo, and 15 additional victims across 6 states. Above them, Sacred Heart Cathedral's bells began their noon prayer call, bronze voices that had marked time for generations of faithful seeking spiritual guidance and community protection. 11 chimes echoed across Riverside City's neighborhoods, calling parishioners to contemplation and worship. Then came the 12th chime, traditional completion of religious time-keeping that measured human hours through sacred rhythm. 30 seconds passed in silence before the 13th chime rang across the cathedral grounds, its resonance carrying supernatural weight that made federal agents pause in their procedural duties. Local residents who had lived near Sacred Heart for decades stopped their midday activities, listening to metallic voice that spoke of justice delayed but never denied. The bells, Daniel whispered, his borrowed identity finally collapsing under federal authority and technological evidence that had penetrated 30 years of ecclesiastical protection. They know. Agent Morgan completed Miranda rights while the 13th chime faded into Texas air, leaving sacred silence that felt heavier than sound. FBI Mobile Command Unit, 12:30 p.m. Daniel Thornfield's confession began with words that echoed Marcus's original recording, completing audio documentation that spanned 3 decades of systematic conspiracy. Dr. Chun operated digital recording equipment while Agent Morgan conducted interrogation that would finally provide closure to families who had waited generations for truth. I assumed my brother's identity to protect his memory, Daniel said, his voice carrying exhaustion that came from carrying stolen authority for 30 years. Marcus called me 3 days before he died, confessing his involvement in covering up institutional problems. He said Archbishop Castellanos demanded loyalty to protect the church's greater mission. What problems? Financial irregularities, abuse cover-ups, systematic protection of clergy who threatened institutional reputation. Marcus had been transferring money through diocese accounts, funding political campaigns that supported church interests, silencing families who posed threats to ecclesiastical authority. Agent Morgan reviewed Isabella's diary entries while questioning Daniel about specific crimes that federal investigation had documented through technological advancement and international cooperation. Isabella Moreno discovered financial records in June 1994. What made her dangerous? She photographed bank statements showing Cardinal Castellanos' signatures on wire transfers to political campaigns. 10-year-old child with evidence that could destroy billion-dollar operation and expose systematic conspiracy across multiple dioceses. So you killed her. I protected the institution that my brother served. Isabella understood too much about financial networks that funded church expansion and political influence. Her mother's city council campaign posed additional threats. Carmen Moreno could have used Isabella's evidence to expose systematic corruption. Dr. Chen's recording equipment captured confession that validated 30 years of investigation by Detective Gabriel Restrepo, whose guilt was finally transforming into purpose through federal authority and technological advancement that made institutional conspiracy vulnerable to individual determination. Tijuana, Mexico. Our Lady of Guadalupe Parish, 1:45 p.m. Father Antonio Velasco, dying of liver cancer in parish hospice care, spoke to his nephew's iPhone camera while delivering live-streamed confession that federal investigators had been requesting for 3 decades. Social media had democratized truth-telling, enabling dying priests to bypass ecclesiastical authority and speak directly to global audience about institutional conspiracy he had witnessed. I saw Isabella Moreno enter Sacred Heart Cathedral basement with Deacon Marcus Thornfield on June 14, 1994, Velasco said, his voice weakened but clear enough for audio analysis that would provide federal prosecution with witness testimony that had been silenced through administrative transfer. I watched from the rectory garden, saw the basement lights burning until nearly midnight, saw Thornfield's car parked at the side entrance hours after evening mass concluded. I knew something terrible had occurred, but I chose institutional loyalty over moral responsibility. Father Velasco's nephew held the phone steady while his uncle provided details that corroborated Daniel's confession and validated forensic evidence discovered through technological advancement and federal investigation. Archbishop Castellanos transferred me to Mexico within 48 hours, eliminating potential witness through ecclesiastical authority that superseded civil law enforcement jurisdiction. I have carried this silence for 30 years, protecting institutional reputation while families suffered without closure. The livestream reached 47,000 viewers within the first hour, including Carmen Moreno, who watched dying priest finally deliver testimony that validated her 3 decades of underground investigation and systematic documentation of ecclesiastical conspiracy. Riverside City Community Center Evening Memorial Service, 6 p.m. Detective Gabriel Restrepo stood before assembled families whose children had been silenced by systematic institutional conspiracy, his 30-year journey from guilt to redemption finally reaching completion through federal justice and technological advancement that had transformed individual determination into collective truth. Isabella Moreno was 10 years old when she discovered evidence that exposed billion-dollar conspiracy, Restrepo said, holding her school photograph while addressing community that had waited 3 decades for closure and accountability. Her investigation, documented in diary entries and Polaroid photographs, provided federal prosecutors with evidence that revealed systematic operation across 6 states and multiple dioceses. Isabella's voice has finally been heard. Carmen Moreno approached the memorial podium, carrying Isabella's diary that contained final entry never before revealed to public investigation. Dr. Chun had discovered the pages during forensic analysis, Isabella's last words preserved through technological enhancement that made faded handwriting visible to contemporary examination. Isabella's final diary entry, dated June 14, 1994, Carmen read to the assembled community. Today I showed Detective Restrepo my business card and told him I might need to call about bad things I found. He said children should always tell police about grown-ups doing wrong. I put the important papers in my secret pocket. If something happens to me, Mama should look for the coordinates I wrote on the back. There are more children buried at those numbers. The community center fell silent as Isabella's 10-year-old voice spoke across 30 years, delivering prediction and evidence that had finally enabled justice through federal authority and technological advancement that made institutional conspiracy vulnerable to individual courage. Sacred Heart Cathedral Bell Tower, 7:15 p.m. Local news crews filmed the 13th bell that had remained silent since Isabella's disappearance. Bronze voice that local tradition claimed only rang when sacred ground witnessed injustice requiring supernatural intervention. Bell specialist Maria Santos examined the mechanism that had functioned independently during Daniel's arrest, operating without human control through acoustic resonance that defied mechanical explanation. The 13th bell rang exactly 30 years, 5 months, and 17 days after Isabella Moreno disappeared, Santos explained to assembled media representatives. Indigenous traditions describe sacred bells that call for justice when earthly authority fails to protect innocent victims. Federal investigators documented the supernatural element through audio analysis and mechanical examination, but found no rational explanation for timing that coincided precisely with Daniel Thornfield's arrest and confession. Scientific methodology had delivered justice, but sacred mystery had marked its completion through bronze voice that spoke beyond human understanding. FBI Field Office, Las Vegas Evening Briefing, 8:45 p.m. Agent Morgan reviewed case closure documentation while Dr. Chun completed forensic analysis that would provide federal prosecutors with evidence for systematic conspiracy charges spanning 3 decades and multiple jurisdictions. Daniel Thornfield, 17 counts of murder across 6 states. Cardinal Castellanos, international money laundering and conspiracy charges pending extradition from Switzerland. Additional arrest warrants for 43 accomplices who enabled systematic institutional protection. Dr. Chun added technological breakthrough analysis. Artificial intelligence facial recognition exposed identity fraud that human investigation had missed for 30 years. Social media research democratized cold case investigation, generating federal attention that transformed individual tragedy into systematic justice. Outside the Las Vegas field office, evening lights stretched toward distant mountains while sacred bells prepared to ring evening prayers across American dioceses. But in Texas, Sacred Heart Cathedral's 13th bell had finally spoken, marking completion of justice that required federal authority and technological advancement to penetrate 3 decades of ecclesiastical conspiracy. Agent Morgan, Dr. Chen continued, there's one more thing. Database analysis has identified similar operational patterns in Oregon diocese. Missing children, systematic transfers, financial irregularities. Someone is using Daniel Thornfield's methodology in different location. The pursuit of justice was ending in Riverside City, but beginning again in Portland, where institutional conspiracy continued through copycat operations that learned from 30 years of successful concealment. Isabella's voice had finally been heard, but other children still needed federal authority and technological advancement to penetrate systematic evil disguised as sacred service. June 14, 2025, Federal Courthouse, San Antonio, Texas, 11:30 a.m. Daniel Thornfield sat motionless as Judge Patricia Hernandez read 17 murder convictions that would end his 34 years of stolen identity and systematic institutional conspiracy. Federal prosecutors had presented technological evidence that transformed decades of cold cases into mathematical certainty. DNA analysis, facial recognition data, financial records that documented conspiracy spanning 6 states and multiple dioceses. Life sentence without possibility of parole on each count, to be served consecutively, Judge Hernandez announced while families of victims filled the courtroom's gallery seating. Total sentencing, for 125 years in federal custody. Detective Gabriel Restrepo, now 63 and representing victims' families as federal witness coordinator, watched justice delivered through technological advancement and federal authority that had finally penetrated ecclesiastical immunity. Beside him, Carmen Moreno held Isabella's school photograph, forever 10 years old, forever the child who had documented evidence that exposed billion-dollar conspiracy. Your Honor, Daniel spoke for the first time during sentencing proceedings, his voice carrying exhaustion that came from maintaining deception for 3 decades. I want the families to understand that Isabella Moreno was braver than any adult in this investigation. She saw truth when institutional authority demanded blindness. Judge Hernandez completed sentencing while federal marshals prepared transport documentation. Outside the courthouse, media representatives documented conclusion of investigation that had required artificial intelligence and international cooperation to expose systematic institutional conspiracy disguised as religious service. The 13th bell had finally stopped ringing. October 15, 2025, United States Capitol Building, Washington, D.C. Representative Maria Santos stood before the House of Representatives while presenting the Isabella Moreno Child Protection Act. Comprehensive legislation inspired by federal investigation that had revealed how religious immunity enabled systematic conspiracy across state jurisdictions. This legislation requires federal oversight of religious institutions receiving public funding, mandates technological reporting systems for missing children cases, and establishes federal task forces specializing in institutional conspiracy investigations, Representative Santos explained to assembled lawmakers. The bill contained provisions developed through collaboration between Dr. Sarah Chen's forensic research, federal prosecutors who had pursued Daniel Thornfield's conviction, and families who had transformed personal tragedy into systematic reform advocacy. Carmen Moreno sat in the gallery, watching democratic process that transformed her daughter's 10-year-old investigation into national policy that would protect future generations from institutional betrayal. Isabella's evidence had evolved from hidden Polaroid photographs into federal legislation that superseded ecclesiastical immunity through technological oversight and mandatory reporting requirements. The vote was unanimous, 435-0, with senators joining House representatives in acknowledging that Isabella Moreno's courage had exposed vulnerabilities in American law enforcement that required technological solutions and federal authority to address systematic institutional conspiracy. President Elizabeth Martinez signed the Isabella Moreno Child Protection Act into law on November 1, 2025, establishing federal precedent that made religious institutions accountable to civil authority when protecting systematic violence through administrative privilege. December 20, 2025, Esperanza Park, Riverside City, Texas Memorial Dedication Ceremony. The bronze memorial stood 12 feet tall in Park Center, depicting Isabella Moreno with her bicycle, books, and the hidden pocket that had preserved evidence for 31 years. Local artist Roberto Chavez had designed the sculpture to capture Isabella's curiosity and determination, qualities that had enabled systematic justice through individual courage. Detective Gabriel Restrepo, now retired and serving as federal consultant for cold case technological advancement, approached the memorial with his granddaughter Elena, born 6 months after Sophia's identification through DNA analysis that finally provided closure to generational tragedy. Isabella found the truth when adults failed to protect her, Gabriel told Elena, whose 5-year-old understanding absorbed serious conversations about justice and memory. She used her voice when powerful people demanded silence. Carmen Moreno, now 73 and directing the Isabella Moreno Foundation for Missing Children, spoke to an assembled community that had waited 3 decades for closure and accountability. Behind her, Sacred Heart Cathedral's bell tower rose against afternoon sky, bronze voices that no longer carried supernatural mystery, just sacred timekeeping for neighborhood that had finally achieved peace. My daughter's investigation continues through technology that makes institutional conspiracy impossible to maintain, Carmen said, her voice carrying strength developed through decades of underground research and systematic documentation. Isabella's evidence has helped solve 43 additional cold cases across 12 states. Dr. Sarah Chun, attending via video conference from FBI headquarters, presented statistical analysis that demonstrated how Isabella's case had revolutionized federal investigation methodology. Artificial intelligence protocols developed for the Moreno investigation have been applied to over 300 cold cases nationwide, resulting in 127 convictions and 89 missing children identifications, Dr. Chin reported. Isabella's legacy extends far beyond individual justice into systematic transformation of law enforcement capability. Technology Center, Georgetown University, same day, 3:45 p.m. Dr. Amanda Way's Forensic Genealogy Laboratory had become the National Center for Cold Case Investigation, processing DNA evidence and applying artificial intelligence protocols that trace their development to Isabella Moreno's federal investigation. Graduate students worked with equipment that could identify victims through genetic markers spanning multiple generations. The Moreno protocols have transformed impossible cases into solvable investigations, Dr. Way explained to visiting law enforcement representatives from 17 states. Technological advancement inspired by one child's courage now protects children nationwide. On laboratory monitors, current investigations displayed progress reports for missing children cases that would have remained unsolved without computational analysis and federal cooperation pioneered through Isabella's investigation. Technology had become the voice of silenced victims, amplifying truth across jurisdictional boundaries that had protected systematic conspiracy for decades. Final memorial moment, Esperanza Park sunset, 6:30 p.m. As evening light painted Texas sky orange and purple, Carmen Moreno activated audio system that had been installed beside Isabella's memorial. Her daughter's voice, recorded from diary entries through digital enhancement technology, spoke across Esperanza Park while community gathered for closing ceremony. June 10, 1994. Today I helped Father Miguel in the basement. There are so many papers about money. I think they're important because they're in the special filing cabinets with locks. Isabella's 10-year-old voice continued reading diary entries that had become federal evidence, while visual montage displayed on memorial screens showing contemporary cold cases being solved through technological advancement and federal authority inspired by her investigation. June 12, 1994. I asked Deacon Thornfield about the papers. He said children shouldn't worry about church business. But his eyes got different when he said it. Dr. Chin's voice joined through audio system, providing contemporary analysis. Isabella's documentation techniques are now taught at federal law enforcement academies nationwide. Her evidence collection methodology has become standard protocol for child investigators. June 13, 1994. Tomorrow I'll copy some of the numbers to show Detective Restrepo. He said I could call him if I found something bad. Gabriel Restrepo held his granddaughter while Isabella's voice spoke across 3 decades, delivering investigation legacy that had transformed individual tragedy into systematic protection for future generations. Elena listened with 5-year-old attention while her grandfather's tears marked completion of journey that had required 31 years of technological advancement and federal authority. June 14, 1994. I put the important papers in my secret pocket. If something happens to me, Mama should look for the coordinates I wrote on the back. There are more children buried at those numbers. The audio concluded with contemporary update. Isabella Moreno's coordinates led to discovery of 17 additional victims and exposure of systematic conspiracy across 6 states. Her voice continues protecting children through federal legislation and technological advancement that makes institutional conspiracy vulnerable to individual courage. Sacred Heart Cathedral's bells began evening prayer call, 12 traditional chimes marking sacred time for community that had finally achieved justice through personal tragedy, institutional betrayal, scientific breakthrough, decades-long pursuit, and ultimate accountability. The 13th chime remained silent, its supernatural voice no longer needed in a neighborhood where truth had triumphed over power, technology had amplified silenced voices, and one child's courage had protected countless others through federal authority and systematic reform. Some secrets are buried. Others are recorded. All of them have an expiration date. Isabella Moreno's expiration date was justice, delivered 31 years late, but infinitely valuable to families whose children would never face systematic institutional conspiracy again. Her legacy lived in federal law, technological advancement, and bronze memorial where future generations would understand that individual courage could defeat institutional power through persistent determination and scientific truth. The investigation was complete, but Isabella's voice would continue protecting children forever. Isabella's legacy is protecting future children through legislation and technology. Your legacy could be helping her story reach one parent who needs to hear it, one child who needs to know adults will listen, one investigator who needs to see that cases are never truly cold. Subscribe if you want to be part of the solution instead of part of the silence.